Hi, I'm Jessica. My stepfather called me a mistake for 23 years, said I was broken goods, damaged military surplus that nobody wanted. He made sure I knew that every single day until I shipped out to Afghanistan. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my blood carried a secret worth more than his entire pathetic existence. A DNA test meant to help my battle buddy find his family ended up revealing mine. And when I discovered who my real father was, everything changed. The man who spent decades tearing me down was about to learn exactly what kind of mistake I really was. Before we dive in, tell me what time you're watching this and where you're tuning in from. I read every single comment, and I want to know where my fellow fighters are checking in from tonight. The ice maker in my studio apartment hummed against the thin wall, the same mechanical sound that used to keep me awake during those first months back stateside. I'd grown to find it comforting now, that steady rhythm that meant I was home, safe, alive. Not like the sounds that used to jolt me awake overseas. Mortars in the distance, helicopters cutting through the pre-dawn darkness, the static crackle of radio chatter that could mean life or death depending on what came next. I sat cross-legged on my second-hand couch, laptop balanced on my knees, staring at the email that had been sitting in my inbox for 3 days. The subject line was simple: DNA match results, urgent response requested. I'd taken the test 6 months ago, not for myself, but to help Marcus, my battle buddy who'd been searching for his biological parents since we got back from deployment. We'd done it together, spit into those little tubes like it was just another mission checkpoint. He'd found his family within weeks, a tearful reunion with a mother who'd given him up for adoption, but never stopped wondering where he was. I'd expected nothing. My stepfather, Robert Kellerman, had made it clear from the day he married my mother when I was 3 that I was excess baggage, a reminder of her past mistakes. "Your daddy was a nobody," he'd tell me whenever I asked questions. "Left your mother high and dry when he found out she was knocked up. You're lucky I was willing to take on damaged goods." He'd say it with that cold smile that never reached his eyes, the one that told me I should be grateful for the roof over my head and the food on my plate, even if it came with a daily helping of contempt. My mother, Linda, never contradicted him. She'd just look away, focus on folding laundry or preparing dinner, her silence heavy with secrets I could never seem to crack. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at me with this expression I couldn't quite read, not love, not exactly, but something closer to regret. Like she was sorry about something but couldn't bring herself to say what. The apartment felt smaller than usual as I finally clicked on the email. The DNA company's logo filled the screen, followed by a message that made my hands shake. "Dear Jessica Martinez, we have identified a close family match in our database. Based on genetic markers, we have determined with 99.7% certainty that you share a parent-child relationship with the following individual, William Blackstone III. I stared at the name, reading it over and over until the letters started to blur. William Blackstone III. It sounded like old money, like the kind of name you'd see engraved on university buildings or hospital wings. Nothing like the collection of blue-collar surnames that populated my childhood. Kellerman, Rodriguez, Murphy, names that belonged to mechanics and construction workers and checkout clerks at the local grocery store. My laptop screen dimmed, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I touched the trackpad, bringing the page back to life, and scrolled down to find more information. There was a link to a profile, and I clicked it with trembling fingers. The photograph that loaded made me drop the laptop onto the couch cushions. Staring back at me was a man in his 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing what looked like a $1,000 suit. But it wasn't the expensive clothes or the confident posture that made my breath catch. It was the face. My face, aged and masculine, but unmistakably familiar. The same green eyes that looked back at me from mirrors, the same stubborn set to the jaw, the same slight cleft in the chin that Robert Kellerman had always said made me look defective. Below the photo was a brief biography that read like something from Forbes magazine. William Ashford Blackstone III, CEO and chairman of Blackstone Industries, philanthropist, and venture capitalist. Net worth estimated at $2.3 billion, resides in Manhattan with extensive properties in the Hamptons, Napa Valley, and abroad. $2.3 billion. I set the laptop aside and walked to my bathroom, flipping on the harsh fluorescent light above the mirror. The face that looked back at me was tired, marked by stress lines that had nothing to do with my 26 years, and everything to do with 2 tours overseas and a lifetime of being told I wasn't worth much. But underneath the exhaustion, I could see it now. The resemblance that had always been there, waiting for me to have a reason to look for it. The same eyes that gazed out from that professional headshot. The same bone structure that spoke of generations of good breeding and expensive dental work. I'd inherited his features, but I'd earned my scars the hard way. I returned to the couch and opened a new browser tab, typing William Blackstone III into the search bar. The results filled my screen. Business articles, charity gala photos, interviews in financial magazines. Page after page of a life lived in the spotlight, surrounded by luxury I couldn't even imagine. There were pictures of him at art auctions, cutting ribbons at hospital openings, shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. In one photo from a Society magazine, he stood with his arm around a blonde woman in an evening gown, both of them, smiling at some charity fundraiser. The caption identified her as Margaret Blackstone, wife of 32 years. Behind them, I could make out glimpses of a world I'd only seen in movies. Crystal chandeliers, marble columns, people dressed in clothes that cost more than my entire annual salary. I scrolled through image after image, looking for any sign that this man had ever known about my existence. Any hint that somewhere in his gilded world, there was space for a daughter he'd never met. But all I found were photos of a carefully curated life, complete with a wife who looked like she'd never set foot in a trailer park and social circles that would probably view my military service as quaint rather than heroic. My phone buzzed, with a text from Marcus. "How'd the DNA thing turn out? Find any long-lost relatives?" I stared at the message, not sure how to begin explaining what I'd discovered. How do you tell someone that your entire life has been built on a lie? That the father you never knew wasn't some deadbeat who abandoned your mother, but a billionaire, who might not even know you exist? I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the parking lot of my apartment complex, with its cracked asphalt and flickering streetlights. Tomorrow, I'd have to get up and go to my job at the Veterans Assistance Office, helping other former service members navigate the maze of benefits and bureaucracy that was supposed to take care of us when we came home broken. It was good work, meaningful work, but it paid just enough to cover my rent and groceries with a little left over for the community college classes I was taking at night. It was a world away from Manhattan penthouses and charity galas, but it was mine. I'd built it from nothing, with no help from anyone, carrying the weight of Robert Kellerman's constant reminders that I was a burden, a mistake, someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps life threw my way. Now I knew the truth. My real father wasn't some loser who'd abandoned my mother. He was one of the most successful men in America, someone whose signature on a check could change lives, whose name opened doors I didn't even know existed. The question was, what was I going to do about it? The next morning felt different, like waking up in someone else's life. I'd barely slept, my mind racing between disbelief and a strange kind of anger I couldn't quite name. The coffee maker gurgled to life at 0600 hours, same as always. Military. Habits die hard. But even that familiar routine felt hollow now. Everything I thought I knew about myself had been rewritten overnight by a simple email and a DNA test I'd taken on a whim. I dressed for work in my standard uniform, pressed khakis, a polo shirt with the Veterans Assistance Center logo, and the same black flats I'd been wearing for 2 years. Looking in the mirror, I tried to see William Blackstone's features in my reflection again. but in the harsh morning light, it felt like something I might have imagined. Maybe that's what I wanted, for it all to be some elaborate mistake, a glitch in the system that would disappear with a follow-up email apologizing for the error. The drive to work took me through the same neighborhoods I'd been navigating for 3 years since moving to Richmond after my discharge. Past the gas station where I bought my morning energy drink. Past the elementary school where kids were already gathering for another day. Past the strip mall that housed everything from a check cashing place to a dollar store. Working class? America, where $100 could make the difference between keeping the lights on and sitting in the dark. Where people like me helped people like us figure out how to survive in a system that seemed designed to forget we existed. The Veterans Assistance Center occupied half of a converted warehouse, sharing space with a furniture donation center and a small engine repair shop. It wasn't glamorous, but it served its purpose. We had 12 desks, 4 computers that worked, most of the time, and a break room with a microwave that had seen better decades. The walls were covered with information posters about PTSD resources, job placement programs, and benefit applications, a roadmap for rebuilding lives that had been interrupted by service to a country that sometimes seemed to struggle with how to welcome us home. I was the first one in, as usual. I liked the quiet before the phones started ringing and the steady stream of veterans began filing through our doors. It gave me time to think, to prepare for the day's challenges. But this morning, instead of reviewing case files, I found myself opening a new browser tab and returning to my research from the night before. William Blackstone III stared back at me from his corporate headshot, and in the fluorescent lighting of the office, the resemblance seemed even more undeniable. I'd inherited his bone structure, his eye color, even the way his left eyebrow sat slightly higher than his right. But more than that, I'd inherited something else. A stubborn set to the jaw that I recognized from my own mirror. The same expression I wore when someone told me something couldn't be done. I scrolled through more articles, piecing together a timeline of his life. Born into old money, educated at Harvard and Wharton, he'd taken over his family's manufacturing company in his 30s and transformed it into a diversified empire that touched everything from technology to real estate to renewable energy. He was known for his shrewd business sense, his philanthropic efforts, and his carefully maintained public image. But there was something missing from all these profiles, some gap in the narrative that I couldn't quite identify. The articles mentioned his wife Margaret, their marriage of 32 years, their involvement in various charities. But nowhere did I find mention of children. For a man whose family had been building legacies for generations, that seemed strange. You're here early, even for you. I looked up to find Tom Harrigan, my supervisor, standing in the doorway with his usual morning coffee and skeptical expression. Tom was a Vietnam vet who'd been running the center for 15 years, a man who'd seen every sob story, every bureaucratic nightmare, every case of the system failing the people it was supposed to serve. He had radar for when something was off, and apparently, I was pinging that radar this morning. Couldn't sleep, I said, closing the browser window. Figured I'd get a head start on the Peterson disability appeal. Tom nodded, but his eyes lingered on my face for a moment longer than usual. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. In a way, I had. The ghost of a father I'd never known, a life I'd never imagined possible, a truth that reframed every cruel word Robert Kellerman had ever spoken to me. But I wasn't ready to share that with anyone, especially not Tom, who already worried too much about his staff burning out. I'm fine, I said. Just tired. The first veteran through our doors that morning was Mrs. Eleanor Rodriguez, a 73-year-old Navy veteran whose husband had died 6 months earlier. She was trying to navigate the maze of survivor benefits, and the VA had been giving her the runaround for weeks. I'd been working her case for a month, making phone calls, filing appeals, trying to cut through the red tape that stood between her and the financial support she was entitled to. "Any news on my case, Mija?" she asked, settling into the chair. across from my desk with the careful movements of someone whose body had carried too much weight for too many years. I pulled up her file, scanning the notes from my latest phone call with the regional office. I spoke with Supervisor Martinez yesterday. He says they're still processing your husband's service records, but he's confident we'll have an answer within 2 weeks. Mrs. Rodriguez's face fell slightly. 2 weeks. That's what they said last month. I reached across the desk and touched her weathered hand. I know it's frustrating, but I'm not giving up on this, okay? You served your country for 22 years. You earned these benefits. She smiled, the expression transforming her tired features. You're a good girl, Jessica. Your parents raised you right. The words hit me like a physical blow. My parents. For 23 years, I'd believed that meant Linda Martinez, a woman who'd worked double shifts at a diner to keep us afloat, and Robert Kellerman, a man who'd made sure I knew I was an unwanted burden every single day. Now I knew that half of that equation was a lie, and the other half was more complicated than I'd ever imagined. Thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez, I managed. I'll call the regional office again this afternoon. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and meetings with veterans who needed help navigating systems that seemed designed to wear them down. Each case was a reminder of how difficult it could be to get what you'd earned. How many obstacles could stand between someone and the support they deserved? I'd always found purpose in this work, in being the advocate that so many veterans needed. But today, with William Blackstone's face fresh in my memory, and his billions of dollars changing everything I thought I knew about my place in the world, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was playing a game where I didn't know all the rules. During my lunch break, I walked to the small park across the street and called my mother. Linda Martinez worked the evening shift at Riverside Diner now, which meant she was usually home during the day, catching up on soap operas and household tasks that Robert expected to be done by the time he got home from his job at the auto parts store. Jess? What's wrong? You never call during work hours. Even after all these years, her first assumption was that something was wrong. Maybe because in our family, something usually was. Nothing's wrong, Mom. I just wanted to talk to you. About something. A pause. In the background, I could hear the television. Some talk show where people aired their dirty laundry for the entertainment of strangers. What about? About my father. My real father. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Jessica, we've talked about this. Robert is your father. He raised you. No, Mom. Robert is your husband. He's the man who made sure I knew I was unwanted every single day of my childhood. But he's not my father, and we both know it. Another pause. I could picture her sitting in the living room of the double-wide trailer that had been my childhood home, surrounded by the ceramic figurines she collected and the faded photographs that documented a life of small pleasures and large compromises. Why are you bringing this up now? Because I took a DNA test and I found him. The sharp intake of breath on the other end told me everything I needed to know. She'd been expecting this conversation for 23 years, dreading it, hoping it would never come. But somewhere deep down, she'd known that eventually, the truth would surface. Jessica, baby, you need to let sleeping dogs lie. Some things are better left alone. Better for who? Better for you? Better for Robert? Because it sure as hell hasn't been better for me, Mom. Do you have any idea what it was like growing up? Being told I was a mistake, that I was damaged goods, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of affection came my way. Robert provided for you. He put a roof over your head, food on your table, while reminding me every single day that it was charity, while making sure I knew that I was the reason you couldn't have nice things, the reason he had to work overtime, the reason our lives were harder than they should have been. I was standing now, pacing the small patch of grass under an oak tree, whose leaves were just beginning to turn with the early autumn chill. A few other office workers were scattered around the park, eating lunch and enjoying the mild weather, oblivious to the fact that someone's entire understanding of their identity was crumbling in real time. Who is he, Mom? Who is William Blackstone? The sound she made was half sob, half gasp. How did you— Jesus, Jessica, what have you done? I found out the truth. Finally. After 23 years of lies, I know who my father really is, and I want to know why you never told me. Because some secrets are meant to stay buried, she said, her voice stronger now, tinged with the kind of desperation that comes when you realize your carefully constructed world is about to collapse. Because knowing won't change anything. It'll only make things worse. Worse for who? For everyone. For you? For me. For him. For people who don't deserve to have their lives turned upside down because of mistakes that happened before you were even born. Mistakes. There was that word again. The one that had defined my entire existence. I was a mistake to Robert Kellerman. I was a mistake to my mother. And apparently, I was a mistake to William Ashford Blackstone III, a billionaire who had built an empire while remaining completely unaware that he had a daughter living in a trailer park in rural Virginia. I need to know the whole story, Mom. I need to know how this happened, why you never told him about me, why you let me grow up believing I was unwanted trash. You were never trash, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. You were loved. Maybe not the way you wanted to be loved, but what? But you were too afraid to tell the truth? Too scared of what it might mean for your comfortable little life with Robert? The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but I couldn't take them back. And honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to. For 23 years, I'd been the one carrying the weight of shame, the one who felt like an imposition, the one who had to prove my worth every single day. Now it was time for someone else to carry that burden. It's complicated, Jessica. More complicated than you know. Then explain it to me. I'm a grown woman. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. I think I can handle whatever complicated truth you've been hiding from me. Another long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was resigned, defeated. Not over the phone. If you really need to know, come home this weekend. Robert's going fishing with his brother. We can talk then. I'll be there Saturday morning. Jessica? Her voice was small now, vulnerable in a way I hadn't heard since I was a child, and she used to read me bedtime stories before Robert decided I was too old for such nonsense. Try to remember that everything I did because I thought it was best for you. The call ended, leaving me standing alone in the park with more questions than answers, and the growing certainty that my weekend conversation with my mother was going to change everything. Again. Saturday morning arrived gray and overcast. The sea. Kind of October day that makes you want to stay in bed with coffee and old movies. But I'd been awake since 0500, my body's internal clock refusing to adjust to civilian life even 3 years after discharge. The drive to my childhood home took 43 minutes through winding country roads that hadn't changed much since. I was a teenager desperate to escape them. The double-wide trailer sat on a half-acre lot at the end of a gravel driveway, surrounded by the same chain-link fence Robert had installed when I was 12 to keep the neighbors' dogs out of what he generously called the yard. Mom's car was there, a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a dented rear bumper and a passenger door that stuck. But Robert's pickup truck was nowhere to be seen. Good. I wasn't ready to face him, not yet, not with everything I'd learned about who I really was. I sat in my car for a moment, looking at the place that had shaped the first 18 years of my life. The aluminum siding was starting to show its age, and the small deck Robert had built off the back was sagging slightly on one corner. It wasn't much, but it had been home. Or at least, it had been the place where I slept and ate and counted, down the days until I could join the army, and finally get away from the constant reminder that I didn't belong. Mom must have been watching for me because the door opened before I'd even made it halfway up the concrete steps. She looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow, as if the weight of keeping secrets for 23 years had literally worn her down. Her hair, once a vibrant brown, was now more gray than not, and the lines around her eyes spoke of worries that went deeper than monthly bills and overtime shifts. "You look good, mija," she said, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like the same drugstore perfume she'd worn for as long as I could remember. "Military life agrees with you. I've been out for 3 years, Mom. I know. But you still carry yourself like a soldier. Straight back, chin up. Your father would be proud." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. Which father? The one who'd raised me with constant criticism and barely concealed resentment, or the one whose existence had been hidden from me until a DNA test changed everything? The inside of the trailer looked exactly the same as it had the day I left for basic training. The same brown carpet that had seen better decades, the same collection of ceramic angels on every available surface, the same family photos that told the story of a life lived in small moments: birthday parties at Chuck E. Cheese, Christmas mornings with presents wrapped in newspaper, school pictures with forced smiles and bargain store clothes. I sat at the small kitchen table where I'd done my homework every night, where Robert had lectured me about my grades, my attitude, my general failure to live up to his standards. Mom moved around the kitchen with nervous energy, making coffee we both knew neither of us really wanted. "So," she said finally, settling into the chair across from me with a mug she held like a shield, "you found him." "I found his name. I found his picture. I found out he's worth more money than I can even comprehend. What I haven't found is the truth about how you knew him, why you never told him about me, and why you let me grow up thinking I was some kind of mistake that nobody wanted." Mom's hands tightened around her coffee mug. She stared into it like she might find the right words floating among the cream and sugar. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet with unshed tears. "I was 19, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Working as a waitress at this upscale restaurant in Norfolk, the kind of place where politicians and business people went to make deals over expensive steaks. I'd gotten the job through a friend, and I was so proud of myself. The tips were good, better than anything I'd ever made, and I thought maybe I could save enough money to go to community college." She paused, taking a sip of coffee that seemed to require significant effort. "He came in every Thursday night for about 2 months. Always alone, always ordered the same thing: ribeye steak, medium rare, with a glass of red wine. He was older than me, maybe late 20s, and he wore these beautiful suits that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. But he was kind to the waitstaff, which you don't always see with wealthy people. He asked about my day, remembered details from previous conversations. I could picture it. My young mother, probably beautiful in the way that poverty and hard work couldn't quite hide, waiting tables and dreaming of something better. And William Blackstone, already wealthy but not yet the billionaire he'd become, seeing something in her that made him return week after week. One night, he asked if I'd like to get coffee after my shift. I said yes. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into more. Her cheeks flushed slightly. He told me he was in Norfolk on business, something about acquiring a manufacturing plant. He'd be there for another month, maybe 2. "Did he know your real name?" "Linda Rodriguez. I wasn't Martinez yet. That came later, when I married your stepfather." William knew everything about me, or at least everything I told him. About growing up poor, about my dreams of going to college, about how I wanted something better than the life my parents had. She stood abruptly, walking to the small window above the sink that looked out onto the backyard where I'd played as a child. "He made me feel special, Jessica. Like I mattered. Like my thoughts and dreams were important. For 6 weeks, I lived in this fantasy where I was the kind of woman who could be with a man like that." "What happened?" "He left. His business in Norfolk was finished, and he went back to his real life. He gave me his card, told me to call if I ever needed anything. But we both knew it was over. I was a small-town girl who served him dinner, and he was William Blackstone. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. When did you find out you were pregnant? 3 weeks after he left. I called the number on his card, but it went to some assistant who told me Mr. Blackstone was in meetings all day, and would I like to leave a message. I left my name and number, said it was urgent. He never called. Back? Did you try again? Mom turned from the window and I saw shame written across her features like a scar. I called 6 times over 2 weeks, different times of day, hoping to catch him directly. But it was always the same. His assistant taking messages that apparently never made it to him. Finally, the assistant told me that Mr. Blackstone had asked not to be contacted by anyone from his Norfolk business trip, that all communications should go through the company's legal department. The coldness in my stomach spread upward, reaching my chest. He cut you off. I told myself that maybe he never got the messages. Maybe his assistant was protecting him from what she assumed were gold diggers or opportunists. But after a while, I had to face the truth. He didn't want to hear from me. So you never told him about me. What was I supposed to do? The words came out sharp, defensive. Show up at his office 8 months pregnant, demanding to see him? Tell his secretary that the waitress from Norfolk was carrying his baby? Even if I'd gotten past security, even if I'd somehow managed to get in front of him, what then? He'd made it clear he didn't want any reminders of whatever we'd had. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what I was hearing. My entire life, I'd imagined my biological father as someone who'd abandoned my mother when things got difficult. I'd pictured him as a coward, someone who ran when faced with responsibility. But the reality was more complicated, and somehow worse. He hadn't run. He'd simply closed the door, cutting off all communication before he even knew there were consequences to what they'd shared. What about after I was born? Did you ever think about trying again? Every day for the first year. Mom returned to her seat, her coffee now cold and forgotten. I'd see his name in the newspaper sometimes, in the business section. Success after success, deal after deal. I'd cut out the articles and keep them in a shoebox, telling myself that someday I'd be brave enough to contact him again. But you never did. By the time you were walking and talking, he was married. I saw the wedding announcement in some magazine at the grocery store. Society pages, like something out of a fairy tale. Beautiful blonde woman from the right kind of family, the kind of wedding that gets written up in newspapers and magazines. What was I supposed to do then? Call him up and say, "Congratulations on your marriage, by the way, you have a daughter?" I understood the logic, even as it made me angry. A poor single mother trying to insert herself into the life of a newly married billionaire would have looked exactly like what his assistant had probably been protecting him from. An opportunist, a gold digger, someone trying to cash in on a brief relationship. Then I met Robert, Mom continued. You were 3, and I was working 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. He seemed like an answer to my prayers, a stable man with a steady job who was willing to take on a woman with a child. I thought it was what was best for you, having a father figure, someone to provide stability. Even though he made it clear, from day one, that I was a burden, Mom's face crumpled. I thought he'd come around. I thought once he got to know you, once he saw how smart and sweet you were, he'd love you like his own daughter. But he never did. No, he never did. And by then, it felt too late to change course. You were in school. We had a home, a routine. Disrupting all of that to chase after a man who'd already made it clear he didn't want reminders of his past. It seemed selfish, cruel even. I stood up, needing to move, needing to pace. The small kitchen felt suffocating, filled with the weight of 23 years of secrets and missed opportunities. So instead, you let me grow up thinking I was worthless. You let Robert tear me down every single day because it was easier than telling the truth. It wasn't easier, Mom said, her voice breaking. It was never easier. Do you think it was easy watching him treat you like that? Do you think I didn't die a little inside every time he called you a burden or a mistake? But you never stopped him. I tried. In my own way, I tried. I'd talk to him when you weren't around, ask him to be kinder, to see the good in you. But he'd just say that coddling you wouldn't prepare you for the real world, that someone needed to teach you that life was hard. Someone needed to teach me that I was loved. The words hung between us, simple and devastating. Mom wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing the makeup she'd carefully applied before I arrived. You were loved, Jessica. Maybe not the way you deserved, but you were loved. By who? By you? Because love without protection, love without advocacy, love that stands by while someone tears your child apart. That's not really love, Mom. That's just guilt wearing a different name. I moved toward the door, suddenly desperate for air, for space, for somewhere that didn't smell like old secrets and regret. But I stopped with my hand on the knob, one more question burning in my throat. What's his wife's name? Margaret? Yes, Margaret Ashford Blackstone. They've been married 32 years. Any children? Mom's silence was answer enough. I turned to look at her, and the expression on her face confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. He doesn't have any children, she whispered. From what I've read in the society pages over the years, they never had kids. Some people speculated about fertility issues, but they've never talked about it publicly. The full weight of it hit me then. William Ashford Blackstone III, billionaire businessman, heir to a family fortune built over generations. He had no children, no legitimate heirs to carry on his name or inherit his empire. Except for one daughter he'd never known existed. A daughter who'd grown up in a trailer park being told she was a mistake while he built his fortune just a few hundred miles away. I have to go, I said, pulling open the door. Jessica, please, don't do anything rash. Don't try to contact him. It'll only bring pain for everyone involved. I turned back one last time, looking at the woman who'd given birth to me, who'd protected me in the only way she knew how, who'd kept a secret for 23 years because she thought it was kinder than the truth. The pain's already here. Mom, it's been here my whole life. The only question now is what I'm going to do about it. The drive back to Richmond felt like moving through water. Every mile weighted with the truth I'd finally extracted from my mother. I kept the radio off, needing the silence to process what I'd learned. William Blackstone hadn't abandoned me. He'd never known I existed. The assistant who'd blocked my mother's calls had probably been doing what assistants do, protecting their boss from what they assumed were unwanted complications from his business trips. Standard operating procedure that had accidentally erased me from his life before I'd even drawn my first breath. By the time I reached my apartment, a plan was already forming. Not a reckless confrontation or some dramatic reveal, but something methodical, military. I'd spent 2 tours in Afghanistan learning how to gather intelligence, how to understand an enemy before engaging. William Blackstone wasn't an enemy, but he was an unknown, and I'd learned the hard way that unknowns could kill you if you weren't careful. I spent Sunday conducting what I called reconnaissance: online databases, newspaper archives, business, journals. I built a timeline of William Blackstone's life with the same attention to detail I'd once used to map insurgent networks. Born 1962 to William Blackstone Jr. and Catherine Ashford Blackstone. Attended Phillips Academy, then Harvard. For undergrad and Wharton for his MBA. Took over Blackstone Industries in 1989 when his father died of a heart attack. The business profile painted a picture of calculated success. He'd transformed a regional manufacturing company into a diversified empire through strategic acquisitions and innovative investments. Real estate, technology, green energy, defense contracts. His portfolio read like a masterclass in modern capitalism. But it was the personal details that caught my attention, the gaps in the carefully curated public image. Marriage to Margaret Ashford in 1993, a union that connected two old money families and generated significant coverage in society magazines. But no birth announcements ever followed. No mentions of children in family Christmas card photos that occasionally appeared in social columns. For a man whose family legacy stretched back 4 generations, the absence of heirs seemed like more than just a private choice. I found medical charity donations that suggested the story, significant contributions to fertility research, IVF clinics, adoption agencies. The pattern painted a picture of a couple who'd tried everything to have children and failed. William Blackstone, who could buy anything, own anything, build anything, couldn't have the one thing that would ensure his family's legacy continued. Except he could. He did. She was living in a studio apartment in Richmond, working at a veterans center, completely unaware that she was heir to a billion-dollar empire. Monday morning at work felt surreal. I sat at my desk helping veterans navigate bureaucracy while knowing that I had a father who could probably make those bureaucratic problems disappear with a single phone call. Mrs. Rodriguez came in with updates on her survivor benefits case, still delayed, still caught in the maze of VA paperwork. I made the required calls, filed the appropriate forms, but part of my mind was elsewhere, calculating the distance between my world and William Blackstone's. During my lunch break, I walked to the Richmond Public Library and used their computers to dig deeper. I'd learned in the military that the best intelligence often came from unexpected sources, so I expanded my search beyond business profiles and society pages. Local newspaper archives from Norfolk, dating back to when my mother would have been working there, when William Blackstone was overseeing the acquisition of a manufacturing plant. I found it in a business journal from August 1999. Blackstone Industries completes Norfolk acquisition. The article was brief, focusing on the economic impact of the deal, but it included a photo of William Blackstone touring the facility. He looked younger, his hair still fully brown, but the bone structure was unmistakably familiar. More importantly, the article mentioned he'd spent several weeks in Norfolk, personally overseeing the transition, and that he'd been impressed by the local workforce and community. Several weeks. That matched my mother's timeline. 6 weeks of Thursday night dinners, of coffee after her shifts, of a wealthy businessman and a young waitress creating a daughter they'd never know existed. I printed the article and sat in the library's reading area, staring at the grainy newspaper photo. This was the man who'd shaped half my DNA, whose genes had given me green eyes and a stubborn jaw, and apparently a head for strategy. This was the father I'd never known, captured in a moment when he was still just successful rather than legendary, when he was still young enough to see promise in a waitress's smile. That evening, I called Marcus. My battle buddy had become something of a brother to me over the years, someone who understood the particular challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. He'd been the one to suggest the DNA test in the first place, hoping I might find some extended family that could fill the gaps left by Robert Kellerman's emotional neglect. "So, did you ever hear back from that DNA company?" he asked after we'd covered the usual topics: work, school, his ongoing attempts to convince me to try online dating. You could say that. I told him everything. The DNA match, William Blackstone's identity, my mother's confession, the timeline that made it all make sense. Marcus listened without interruption, which was one of the things I valued most about him. In Afghanistan, he'd been the kind of soldier who could absorb a complex briefing and immediately understand the tactical implications. Civilian life hadn't changed that. "Jesus, Jess, your father's a billionaire." "Biological father," I corrected. "And yes. Do you know what this means? You're not just some random person anymore. You're an heiress. You're connected to serious money, serious power. I'm connected to a man who doesn't know I exist and might not want to know I exist. Or he might be thrilled to discover he has a daughter. Think about it. You said he and his wife never had kids. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe finding out about you would be the best news he's ever received. It was a possibility I'd considered and rejected a dozen times over the past few days. The fairy tale ending where the wealthy father embraces his long-lost daughter, where money solves all problems and families reunite in tearful reconciliation, but I'd learned not to trust fairy tales. Or maybe he'll think I'm a gold digger trying to cash in on a DNA test. Maybe he'll assume I'm running some kind of con. Then you prove you're not. You approach this the right way, with documentation, with evidence. You show him you're not looking for a handout. What if I am looking for a handout? The words surprised me as I said them. I hadn't admitted that to myself yet, but it was true. 23 years of being told I was worthless, of watching my mother work double shifts while Robert complained about supporting someone else's mistake, of scraping by on veterans' benefits and community college financial aid. Yes, part of me was absolutely looking for something from William Blackstone. Not money, exactly. Or not just money. Recognition, acknowledgement. The chance to be seen by someone who mattered, someone whose approval might finally silence Robert Kellerman's voice in my head telling me I wasn't worth the trouble. There's nothing wrong with wanting what you're entitled to, Marcus said. You're his daughter. That means something, legally and morally. Does it? I mean, really? He never chose to be my father. He never made any commitment to me or my mother. Should biology trump choice? Biology created you. Choice is what he gets to make now once he knows the truth. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment looking at the printouts I'd made, the timeline I'd constructed, the evidence I'd gathered. Tomorrow, I'd go back to work, back to helping veterans navigate systems that didn't always serve them well. I'd process Mrs. Rodriguez's benefit claims and answer phones and pretend that my entire understanding of my place in the world hadn't shifted. But I couldn't unknow what I now knew. I couldn't pretend that William Blackstone didn't exist, that his wealth and power and childless marriage weren't factors in an equation I was only beginning to understand. The question was what to do with that knowledge. I opened my laptop and began typing an email, then deleted it. Started a letter by hand, then crumpled it up. How do you contact a billionaire? How do you explain a situation that sounds insane even when you're living it? Finally, I settled on research. If I was going to make contact, I needed to understand not just who William Blackstone was, but how he operated, what motivated him, what kind of approach might get through his layers of assistance and security. I needed to study him the way I'd once studied Taliban supply routes, with patience, precision, and absolute attention to detail. I started with Blackstone Industries' annual reports, dry documents that nonetheless revealed patterns in how he thought, how he made decisions, what he valued. The company's charitable giving was extensive but focused: medical research, veterans affairs, educational initiatives. He wasn't just writing checks, he was investing in causes that seemed to have personal meaning. The veterans' charities particularly caught my attention. Blackstone Industries had donated millions to organizations supporting wounded warriors, PTSD research, job placement programs for former service members. For someone who'd never served himself, his commitment to military causes seemed unusually personal. I cross-referenced the charity donations with board memberships and discovered that William Blackstone served on the advisory board of 3 different veterans organizations. More than that, he'd been photographed at military events, shaking hands with generals, presenting awards to wounded warriors, speaking at fundraisers for Gold Star families. A pattern emerged. This wasn't just philanthropic obligation or tax. Strategy. William Blackstone had a genuine interest in military affairs, in supporting the men and women who served. Maybe it was guilt over never serving himself, or maybe it was simple patriotism. But the commitment appeared real, and suddenly, I had an angle. I wasn't just William Blackstone's unknown daughter. I was a veteran, someone who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, someone who now worked helping other veterans navigate the challenges of civilian life. I was exactly the kind of person his charitable organizations existed to support. I could approach him through legitimate channels, as a veteran seeking support for the Richmond Veterans Assistance Center. I could request a meeting to discuss funding opportunities, mention the work we were doing, the veterans we were helping. It would get me in the room without immediately revealing the personal connection. From there, I could evaluate the man face to face, decide whether he was someone who deserved to know the truth about his daughter, or someone who was better off never knowing what his Norfolk business trip had created. The plan wasn't perfect, but it was sound, professional, the kind of approach that might actually work. I spent the rest of the evening crafting a letter to William Blackstone's charitable foundation, requesting a meeting to discuss funding opportunities for veterans services in Central Virginia. I kept it brief, professional, mentioning my military service and current work without overselling. The goal was to seem worthy of his time without seeming desperate for his attention. By the time I sealed the envelope, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the naive hope of childhood, but the calculated optimism of someone who's done their homework and identified a viable path forward. William Ashford Blackstone III was about to discover that his Norfolk business trip had consequences he'd never imagined. Whether that discovery would be welcome or devastating remained to be seen. But for the first time in my life, I was going to find out what it felt like to be seen by the man whose blood I carried, whose features I'd inherited, whose empire I might someday be entitled to claim. The letter went in the mail Tuesday morning. The response came faster than I'd expected. 7 days after mailing my letter to the Blackstone Foundation, I found an envelope in my mailbox with the familiar corporate logo embossed in the corner. My hands shook slightly as I opened it, standing in the cramped hallway of my apartment building while Mrs. Chen from 2B collected her mail and pretended not to notice my obvious nervousness. The letter was brief and professional, typed on heavy paper that probably cost more per sheet than I spent on groceries in a week. It was signed by someone named Catherine Mills, Director of Veterans Affairs for the Blackstone Foundation, and it invited me to a preliminary meeting to discuss potential funding opportunities for the Richmond Veterans Assistance Center. The ECO meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 2 p.m. at the Foundation's offices in downtown Richmond. Not New York. Not some intimidating corporate headquarters. Richmond. The Foundation had local offices I'd never even known existed, which meant William Blackstone's charitable empire was more extensive than I'd realized. It also meant I wouldn't have to travel hundreds of miles for what might be a brief, polite rejection. I read the letter 3 times, looking for subtext, for any indication that they'd seen through my professional request to the personal motivation underneath. But there was nothing suspicious, just the kind of formal courtesy you'd expect from a well-funded organization dealing with the endless stream of funding requests they probably received. That night, I called in a favor with Sarah Martinez, a social worker at the Veterans Center who'd been trying to get me to go out with her cousin for the past 6 months. Sarah had a master's degree in nonprofit administration and actually understood how to talk to foundation representatives without sounding desperate or incompetent. "You want me to come with you to this meeting?" she asked when I explained the situation. I'd given her the sanitized version, an opportunity to secure additional funding for our programs, a chance to expand services for local veterans. Nothing about DNA tests or long-lost fathers or the possibility that I was sitting on the biggest secret in Virginia. "I could use the backup," I said. "You know how to speak their language. I know how to help individual veterans, but talking to money people about systemic solutions, that's not exactly my specialty." Sarah agreed, probably thinking this was exactly the kind of professional development opportunity that could advance both our careers. She spent Tuesday evening coaching me on foundation terminology, on how to present need without sounding desperate, on the importance of demonstrating measurable outcomes and sustainable impact. The key, she explained over Chinese takeout in my apartment, is to make them feel like partners rather than benefactors. These foundation people want to be part of something successful, not just write checks to charity cases. I nodded, taking notes while half my attention remained focused on the bigger picture. In less than 2 days, I'd be in the same building as people who worked directly for William Blackstone. People who might have insights into his character, his priorities, his personal life. It was reconnaissance disguised as professional networking. Wednesday night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed running through scenarios, trying to imagine how the meeting might unfold. Best case scenario. We'd secure funding for the Veterans Center, and I'd gather enough intelligence about William Blackstone to determine whether direct contact was worth the risk. Worst case scenario, they'd see through my request, somehow connect me to the DNA test results, and I'd find myself facing questions I wasn't prepared to answer. By Thursday morning, I'd convinced myself I was making a mistake. What if someone at the foundation had been instructed to watch for exactly this kind of approach? What if wealthy men like William Blackstone regularly dealt with people claiming to be long-lost relatives, and his organization had protocols for identifying and deflecting such attempts? I dressed carefully, choosing my most professional outfit, a navy blue suit I'd bought for job interviews after leaving the Army, paired with conservative heels and minimal jewelry. I wanted to look competent and serious, someone worth taking seriously rather than someone who might be running a con. Sarah met me in the parking garage of the downtown office building that housed the Blackstone Foundation's Richmond operations. She looked calm and confident in her element, which helped steady my nerves. Together, we took the elevator to the 15th floor, where frosted glass doors opened onto a reception area that managed to be both elegant and welcoming. The receptionist, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying hair, directed us to a conference room where Catherine Mills was waiting. Mills appeared to be in her early 50s, professionally dressed with the kind of understated confidence that comes from years of managing significant resources. She stood to greet us with genuine warmth, which immediately put me at ease. Ms. Martinez, she said, shaking our hands. Thank you for coming in. I was intrigued by your letter, particularly your background and current work with local veterans. We settled around a polished conference table while Mills pulled out my original letter, along with what appeared to be a preliminary research packet about the Richmond Veterans Assistance Center. They'd done their homework, which meant they were taking the meeting seriously. Before we discuss potential funding opportunities, Mills continued, I'd love to hear more about your personal motivation for this work. Your military service, your transition to civilian advocacy. What drives your commitment to helping other veterans? I'd prepared for this question, but sitting in that conference room, with William Blackstone's foundation logo on the wall behind Mills and his charitable philosophy printed on material scattered across the table, the prepared answer felt inadequate. Instead, I found myself telling the truth. I grew up feeling like I didn't belong anywhere, I said. When I joined the Army, it was the first time I'd ever been part of something bigger than myself. The first time I'd felt like I had value beyond just taking up space. When I came home, that feeling disappeared again. The transition was harder than I'd expected, and I realized that a lot of veterans were struggling with the same sense of displacement. Mills nodded, making notes. And your current role at the Veterans Center? I help other veterans navigate systems that aren't always designed with their needs in mind. Benefits applications, disability claims, job placement services. A lot of what we do is just advocacy, being the voice that speaks up when someone isn't being heard. That's exactly the kind of work Mr. Blackstone believes in supporting, Mills said. He's often spoken about the importance of individual advocacy, of ensuring that people don't fall through the cracks of larger systems. The casual mention of William Blackstone sent electricity through my nervous system. Does Mr. Blackstone take a personal interest in the Foundation's work? Oh, absolutely. He reviews all significant funding decisions personally, and he often visits programs we support. He believes in seeing the impact of charitable investments firsthand. My heart rate accelerated. He visits programs personally? When his schedule allows. He's particularly committed to veterans affairs. I think it stems from his father's service in Vietnam. William Sr. served 2 tours before taking over the family business. New information. William Blackstone's father had been military, which explained the personal connection to veterans' causes. It also suggested that my military service might carry additional weight in any eventual personal meeting. Sarah smoothly transitioned into the technical aspects of our funding request, presenting the needs assessment we'd prepared and outlining specific programs that could benefit from foundation support. Mills asked detailed questions about our current client load, success rates, measurable outcomes. The conversation felt genuine, professional, promising. Based on what you've shared today, Mills said as the meeting began to wind down, I think there's definitely potential for partnership. Our next step would be a site visit. Mr. Blackstone likes to see programs in action before making funding commitments. A site visit? My voice came out higher than intended. Standard procedure. He'd want to tour your facilities, meet some of the veterans you serve, get a sense of the day-to-day operations. Would that be something you'd be comfortable arranging? I looked at Sarah, who nodded enthusiastically. From her perspective, this was exactly the kind of high-level interest that could transform our small veterans center into something much more significant. Of course, I managed. When might that happen? Mills consulted her calendar. Mr. Blackstone will be in Richmond next Friday for another foundation meeting. I could potentially arrange for him to stop by your center that afternoon, if that works with your schedule. Next Friday, 6 days away. 6 days to prepare for my first face-to-face meeting with the man whose DNA I carried, whose blood ran through my veins, whose existence had been hidden from me for 26 years. That would be perfect, I said, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. After we left the foundation offices, Sarah was practically bouncing with excitement. Jessica, do you realize what just happened? We're going to get a personal visit from William Blackstone. Do you know how many organizations would kill for that kind of access? I nodded, trying to match her enthusiasm while my mind raced through the implications. In 6 days, I'd be in the same room as my biological father. I'd be able to study his mannerisms, hear his voice, observe how he interacted with people. I'd finally be able to evaluate whether he was someone who deserved to know the truth about his daughter. We need to prepare, Sarah continued, as we walked back to our cars. Client testimonials, program statistics, maybe arrange for some of our success stories to be available for brief meetings. This could change everything for the center. That evening, I sat in my apartment with my laptop open, researching everything I could find about William Blackstone's personal interaction, style, video interviews, congressional testimony, speech footage from charity events. I studied his body language, his speech patterns, the way he responded to different types of questions. What I discovered was a man who seemed genuinely engaged with the causes he supported. In footage from veterans' events, he didn't just shake hands and pose for photos. He asked detailed questions, listened intently to responses, appeared to remember personal details from previous encounters. Either he was an exceptional actor or his commitment to military causes was authentic. I also noticed something else. He looked tired. In recent photos, there were lines around his eyes that spoke of more than just age, a slight slump to his shoulders that suggested the weight of significant responsibility. He was 61 years old, at the pinnacle of his professional success. But something in his demeanor suggested that the achievements hadn't brought the satisfaction he'd expected. Maybe Marcus had been right. Maybe a man who'd built an empire, but had no children to inherit, it would welcome the discovery of a daughter. Maybe the absence of heirs in his carefully constructed life was a source of regret rather than relief. Or maybe I was projecting, seeing what I wanted to see in grainy newspaper photos and carefully edited video footage. Friday couldn't come fast enough, and simultaneously felt like it was approaching too quickly. In 6 days, I'd either gain a father or lose the fantasy of one forever. Either way, My life was about to change in ways I couldn't fully anticipate. I spent the weekend preparing the Veterans Center for the most important visit in its history, while secretly preparing myself for the most important meeting of my life. The convergence of professional opportunity and personal revelation felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that once I stepped forward, there would be no going back to the simple certainties of my previous existence. William Ashford. Blackstone III was coming to Richmond, and his daughter would be waiting. The week leading up to William Blackstone's visit passed in a blur of nervous preparation. I threw myself into organizing the Veterans Center with an intensity that bordered on obsessive, rearranging furniture, updating client files, and rehearsing conversations I might never have. Sarah noticed my heightened energy but attributed it to professional anxiety rather than the personal earthquake I was actually experiencing. "You're acting like the president is coming to visit," she teased on Wednesday afternoon as I rearranged the waiting area chairs for the third time. "It's just a foundation visit. Important, yes, but you're making yourself crazy. If only she knew." I was 3 days away from meeting the man whose face I saw in mirrors, whose genes had shaped my bone structure and eye color, whose absence had defined my entire childhood. The professional stakes were significant. Potential funding that could transform our small center into something that could help hundreds more veterans. But the personal stakes were everything. Thursday evening, I drove to a department store and bought a new outfit. Nothing too expensive. I couldn't afford designer clothes and wouldn't have known how to wear them if I could, but something that would make me look competent and professional. A charcoal gray dress with a blazer, simple but well-fitted. I wanted to make a good impression without appearing to try too hard. That night, I called my mother. I hadn't spoken to her since our confrontation the previous weekend, and part of me wasn't sure I was ready to bridge that gap, but I needed someone who knew the full truth, someone who could understand the magnitude of what was about to happen. "Jessica?" Her voice was cautious when she answered, probably expecting another angry interrogation about the secret she'd kept. "I'm going to meet him tomorrow." Silence. Then, "Meet who?" "William Blackstone, my biological father. He's coming to the Veterans Center on a foundation visit. He doesn't know who I am, but I'll be in the same room with him." "Oh, mija." The words came out like a prayer. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" "No, I'm not sure of anything. But it's happening whether I'm sure or not." "What are you going to do? Are you going to tell him?" "I don't know. I want to see what kind of man he is first. See if he's someone who deserves to know he has a daughter." Another pause. "Jessica, promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't do anything that can't be undone. Like keeping me secret for 26 years? The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but I wasn't ready to let her off the hook completely. She'd made choices that had shaped my entire life, and one foundation meeting wasn't going to erase the years of feeling unwanted and misplaced. "I know you're angry," she said quietly. "You have every right to be. But please, think about what you're risking, not just for yourself, but for him too. He's built a life, a marriage, a public image. Finding out about you, it could destroy things he's spent decades building. Or it could give him something he's always wanted. You said he and his wife never had children. Maybe that's been the missing piece of his life. Maybe. Or maybe there are reasons they never had children that you don't understand. Maybe bringing you into his world would complicate things in ways that hurt everyone involved." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment, trying to imagine the different ways tomorrow could unfold. Best case scenario, William Blackstone and I would have some kind of natural connection, some recognition that transcended our lack of shared history. I'd find a way to reveal the truth, and he'd welcome me into his life with the warmth I'd always dreamed of from a father. Worst case scenario, he'd be cold, dismissive, someone whose wealth and power had insulated him from genuine human connection. The revelation of my existence would be an unwelcome complication, something his lawyers would need to manage rather than something his heart would need to embrace. Most likely scenario, something in between. A complex man dealing with complex information, requiring time and careful consideration before making any life-changing decisions. Friday morning arrived gray and rainy, typical October weather that matched my nervous energy. I arrived at the Veterans Center 2 hours early, ostensibly to make final preparations, but really because I couldn't sit still at home anymore. Tom Harrigan was already there, of course. He always beat everyone to the office, and he looked up from his computer when I walked in. "Big day," he said. "You ready for this?" "As ready as I can be." "Good. Blackstone's visit could change everything for us. More funding, higher profile, maybe even media attention that brings in additional donors." He paused, studying my face. "You seem nervous. More nervous than the situation warrants." Tom had been reading people for 40 years, first as a soldier in Vietnam and then as an advocate for veterans navigating civilian systems. He had a talent for seeing beneath surface presentations, which made him excellent at his job and occasionally uncomfortable to work for. "It's a big opportunity," I said. "I don't want to mess it up." "You won't. You're good at this work, Jessica. You connect with people. You understand their problems. You fight for solutions. Those are exactly the qualities that impress foundation people." If only he knew that my connection to this particular foundation person was more complicated than professional competence. Sarah arrived at noon with a folder full of client testimonials and program statistics. We spent an hour rehearsing potential questions, role-playing different scenarios, preparing for every angle except the one that mattered most to me. She had no idea that her colleague was about to meet her biological father for the first time. Eddie O. 1:45 p.m., a Blacktown car pulled up outside the center. Through the window, I watched as a driver got out and opened the rear door. William Ashford Blackstone III emerged, and for a moment, seeing him in person rather than in photographs, I forgot how to breathe. He was taller than I'd expected, probably 6'2", with the kind of presence that filled space even when he was standing still. His hair was silver white, perfectly styled, and he wore a dark suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. But it was his face that stopped me. My face, aged and masculine but unmistakably familiar. The same green eyes, the same stubborn set to the jaw, the same slight asymmetry that made his left eyebrow sit higher than his right. He paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the building that housed our center, and I saw him check his watch. Punctual, professional, taking a moment to orient himself before entering unfamiliar territory. Catherine Mills got out of the car behind him, along with another man I didn't recognize, probably an aide or security, someone whose job was to manage the logistics of William Blackstone's carefully scheduled life. "They're here," Sarah whispered, though I was already moving toward the door. Tom stepped forward to greet them as they entered, extending his hand with the kind of confident professionalism that had made him successful in civilian life after Vietnam. "Mr. Blackstone, welcome to the Richmond Veterans Assistance Center. I'm Tom Harrigan, director." "Tom, pleasure to meet you." William Blackstone's voice was deeper than I'd expected, with traces of an accent that spoke of East Coast, education, and boardroom confidence. "Catherine's told me impressive things about your operation here." His handshake with Tom was firm, engaged, the grip of someone who'd learned early that first impressions mattered in business. He made eye contact, asked a follow-up question about Tom's military service, seemed genuinely interested in the answer. Either he was exceptionally skilled at projecting interest he didn't feel, or his commitment to veterans' causes was authentic. "I'd like you to meet our team," Tom said, gesturing toward Sarah and me. "Sarah Martinez, our social services coordinator, and Jessica Martinez, who handles individual case advocacy." The moment arrived faster than I'd expected and slower than I'd feared. William Blackstone turned toward me, extending his hand, and I found myself looking directly into eyes that were identical to my own. "Jessica, Pleasure to meet you. His handshake was warm, professional, lasting exactly the appropriate length of time. Catherine mentioned your military service. Where did you deploy? Afghanistan. 2 tours between 2018 and 2021. Thank you for your service. The words could have been perfunctory, the kind of thing wealthy civilians said to veterans because it was expected. But something in his tone suggested genuine gratitude. What was your role over there? Military intelligence, pattern analysis mostly, tracking supply routes, identifying networks. His eyebrows raised slightly, the left one lifting higher than the right in an expression I'd seen in mirrors my entire life. Intelligence work. That requires a particular kind of mind. Attention to detail, ability to see connections others might miss. It helped that I grew up having to pay attention to subtext, I said. Sometimes what people don't say is more important than what they do. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition of something familiar, in my response. For a moment, we just looked at each other, and I wondered if some part of him was seeing the resemblance I'd been staring at in photographs for the past 2 weeks. Then Catherine Mills stepped forward with questions about our client demographics, and the moment passed. But not before I'd seen something in William Blackstone's expression that made me think my mother might have been wrong about one thing. This was a man capable of genuine connection, someone who looked at people and actually saw them. The question was whether he'd be capable of seeing me clearly enough to recognize that I was his daughter, and whether that recognition would be welcome or devastating for both of us. The tour of our facilities was about to begin, and with it, the most important conversation of my life, even if only one of us knew it was happening. The tour began in our main intake area, where veterans first arrived seeking help with benefits, housing, job placement, or just someone to listen to their stories. William Blackstone moved through the space with careful attention, asking specific questions about our processes, our success rates, the challenges we faced in serving our community. He wasn't just going through the motions. He was genuinely interested in understanding how we operated. How many veterans do you serve annually? He asked Tom as we paused near a bulletin board covered with job postings and community resources. About 800 individual cases, though many clients require ongoing support over several months or even years, Tom replied. Jessica handles our most complex advocacy cases. Veterans who've been denied benefits they're entitled to, or who need help navigating multiple systems simultaneously. William Blackstone turned to me. That must be frustrating work sometimes. Bureaucratic systems aren't always designed with individual needs in mind. It can be, I agreed. But that's exactly why advocacy matters. Sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to accept no as a final answer. He nodded, and I caught something in his expression that looked like approval. Persistence is undervalued in our society. People assume that if someone is struggling with a system, they must be doing something wrong rather than considering that the system itself might be flawed. Exactly. The word came out with more emotion than I'd intended. Too often, we blame individuals for failing to navigate systems that were never designed to serve them effectively. We moved to the counseling area, where Sarah explained our mental health support services. William Blackstone listened intently as she described the challenges many veterans faced in transitioning to civilian life, the importance of peer support, the way trauma could manifest years after discharge. My father served in Vietnam, he said quietly. He never talked much about his experiences there, but I could see how they affected him. The hypervigilance, the difficulty with crowds, the way certain sounds would make him freeze up completely. This was new information, more personal than anything I'd found in my research. Did he ever get help for it? Not really. His generation didn't have the same understanding of PTSD that we do now. He just carried it. I think it shaped his entire approach to life after the war. Everything had to be controlled, planned, secured. He built the business partly as a way to create stability he could depend on. I found myself studying his profile as he spoke, looking for traces of pain or regret in his expression. There was something there, a complicated relationship with a father who'd been shaped by trauma, who'd perhaps passed that trauma down in ways that didn't involve direct service. That must have been difficult for you too, I said, growing up with someone who was struggling with invisible wounds. He turned to look at me directly, and for a moment, the professional distance of the foundation visit fell away. It was. I spent a lot of my childhood trying to figure out how to be what he needed, how to avoid triggering whatever it was that made him retreat into himself. It's probably why I ended up so focused on control, on building systems that couldn't fail. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. This wasn't the carefully managed public persona I'd seen in interviews and corporate videos. This was a man reflecting on the personal costs of his father's service, the way trauma rippled through families in ways that were rarely acknowledged. Is that why you support veterans' causes so extensively? Sarah asked. Because of your father's experience? Partly, but also because I believe we have an obligation to the people who serve. They sacrifice pieces of themselves for something larger, and society has a responsibility to help them rebuild when they come home. We continued the tour, visiting the job placement area where volunteers helped veterans translate military skills into civilian job qualifications, the Benefits Assistance Office where caseworkers helped navigate VA bureaucracy, the small conference room we used for support group meetings. Throughout it all, William Blackstone asked thoughtful questions, took notes, seemed genuinely engaged with understanding our work. But I was studying him on a different level entirely. The way he moved through space with unconscious confidence. The way he listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak, but actually processing what people were telling him. The way he asked follow-up questions that showed he'd been paying attention to details. This was a man who'd built an empire through careful attention to human dynamics, who understood that successful business required understanding people's motivations and needs. It was also a man who seemed genuinely committed to causes beyond his own profit, who'd chosen to spend his Friday afternoon in a converted warehouse listening to stories about veterans' struggles. Jessica, he said as we concluded the tour, Catherine mentioned that you handle complex advocacy cases. Could you give me an example of the kind of work you do? I thought of Mrs. Rodriguez, still waiting for her survivor benefits, still calling every week to check on progress. I have a client, a Navy veteran whose husband died 6 months ago. She's entitled to survivor benefits, but the VA has been slow to process her claim. She's 73 years old, living on Social Security alone, and every week the bureaucracy fails her is another week she struggles to afford basic necessities. What's causing the delay? Missing paperwork mostly. Her husband's service records were stored in a facility that had a fire 20 years ago, so documentation is incomplete. Rather than working with her to find alternative verification, the VA keeps asking for documents that no longer exist. William Blackstone frowned. That's unconscionable. A woman who gave 22 years of her life to service, whose husband also served, shouldn't have to fight for benefits she's clearly entitled to. Exactly. So I make phone calls, I research alternative documentation pathways, I escalate through supervisory chains. Sometimes I have to get creative. Military records from other sources, testimony from fellow service members, medical records that establish timelines. How long have you been working her case? 4 months. He was quiet for a moment, and I could see him processing the implications. 4 months of an elderly woman struggling financially while bureaucrats shuffled papers. 4 months of an advocate spending hours on phone calls and research that should have been unnecessary. 4 months of a system failing someone who'd earned better treatment. What would it take to resolve her case quickly? Honestly, one phone call from someone with enough influence to cut through the bureaucratic maze. Someone who could authorize alternative documentation pathways or expedite the review process. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Catherine, could you get me Senator Williams' office? I'd like to discuss expediting a veterans benefits case. I stared at him. You're going to make that call? Why wouldn't I? You've identified a clear injustice, provided a specific solution, and I happen to know people who can implement that solution. It's the most productive 15 minutes I'll spend this week. While he stepped aside to make his phone call, Sarah grabbed my arm. Did he just offer to personally intervene in Mrs. Rodriguez's case? I think he did. That's not normal foundation behavior, Jessica. Foundation people write checks. They don't make personal calls to senators about individual cases. I watched William Blackstone speaking intently into his phone, gesticulating slightly as he explained the situation to whoever had answered. This was a man who used his power and connections to solve problems, who saw inefficiency and injustice as challenges to be addressed rather than simply acknowledged. This was also a man who'd never known that his brief relationship with a Norfolk waitress had created a daughter, who'd spent 26 years building an empire and supporting causes while his own child grew up in a trailer park, being told she was a mistake. He finished his call and returned to our group. Senator Williams's office is going to contact the VA regional director this afternoon. Your client should have a resolution within the week. Just like that? Just like that. Sometimes the right conversation with the right person can cut through months of bureaucratic delays. He looked at his watch, and I realized our time was almost up. In a few minutes, he'd get back in his town car and return to his world of board, meetings and charitable galas and carefully managed schedules. This brief intersection of our lives would end, and I'd be left with the knowledge of what he was like as a person versus what I'd imagined as a fantasy. Before I go, he said, I want you to know that I'm impressed with what you're doing here. All of you, but particularly you, Jessica. The work you're doing requires not just competence, but genuine commitment to serving others. It's exactly the kind of individual advocacy that changes lives. Thank you. The words felt inadequate for everything I was feeling. That means a lot coming from you. I'd like to discuss potential funding with Tom and Catherine next week, but I can tell you now that the Blackstone Foundation will be supporting your work here. You're doing something important, and you deserve resources that match your impact. As he prepared to leave, William Blackstone shook hands with each of us again. When he reached me, he paused. If you ever decide you want to do this work on a larger scale, policy advocacy, systemic reform, I hope you'll consider reaching out. We can always use people who understand both the individual human cost of broken systems and how to navigate those systems effectively. He handed me his business card, a simple white rectangle with his name and direct contact information. William Ashford Blackstone III. The father I'd never known, offering me opportunities I'd never imagined. I'll keep that in mind, I managed. After they left, Sarah immediately began celebrating our success, talking about funding possibilities and expanded programs. But I barely heard her. I was holding my biological father's business card, processing the reality of the man I'd just met. He was everything I'd hoped for and nothing like what I'd expected. Powerful, but not arrogant. Wealthy, but not disconnected. Successful, but still committed to using that success to help others. He was someone I could respect. Someone I could be proud to call father. The only question now was whether I had the courage to tell him the truth. I held William Blackstone's business card in my hand for 3 hours after he left, sitting in the empty Veterans Center after everyone had gone home. The white rectangle felt heavier than it should have, weighted with possibilities and consequences I was only beginning to understand. His direct phone number, his email address, his personal contact information, everything I needed to reach out and change both our lives forever. The smart thing would have been to wait, to process what I'd learned about him as a person before making any irreversible decisions. But something about our conversation, about the way he'd immediately acted to help Mrs. Rodriguez, about the genuine concern in his voice when he talked about his father's struggles. Something about all of that made waiting feel impossible. That evening, I drove to Marcus's apartment. I needed to talk to someone who understood the military mindset, someone who'd been through their own version of life-changing revelations when he'd found his biological family through DNA testing. Marcus lived in a complex similar to mine, working class but clean, populated by other veterans and young professionals who were building lives one paycheck at a time. "So, how did it go?" he asked, opening a beer for each of us as we settled on his couch. "Did you meet the mysterious billionaire father?" "I met him." I told Marcus everything: the foundation visit, William Blackstone's questions, his immediate intervention in Mrs. Rodriguez's case, the way he'd spoken about his father's service and trauma. "He's not what I expected, Marcus. He's not some cold, distant rich guy. He's someone who actually cares about people, who uses his power to solve problems. Sounds like someone you'd want as a father." "That's the problem. I do want him as a father. For the first time in my life, I've met someone who could actually fill that role, who could be the kind of parent I've always wished I had. But wanting it doesn't make it real." Marcus studied my face. "What are you really afraid of, Jess? That he'll reject you? That he won't believe you? That it'll complicate his life?" "All of that. And more." I took a sip of beer, trying to organize my thoughts. What if he thinks I'm lying? What if he assumes I'm some kind of gold digger who researched his charitable interests and manufactured this whole scenario to get close to him? Rich people must deal with that kind of thing all the time. Then you prove you're not. You show him the DNA results, provide documentation, give him time to verify everything independently. Or what if he believes me but doesn't want me? What if finding out he has a daughter is just an unwelcome complication in his carefully organized life? Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Remember when I found my birth mother? Remember how terrified I was that she'd reject me again? That whatever reason she'd had for giving me up would still be there 25 years later?" I nodded. Marcus had spent weeks agonizing over that first phone call, practicing conversations he might never have, preparing for rejection that might destroy the fantasy he'd carried his entire life. "But it wasn't rejection," he continued. "It was complicated, sure. There were reasons she'd given me up that weren't about not wanting me. There were circumstances I'd never understood, consequences I'd never considered. But the fundamental truth was that she'd never stopped thinking about me, never stopped wondering what had happened to the baby she'd given up. This is different. William Blackstone never knew I existed. He's not wondering what happened to me because he never knew. There was a me to wonder about. Maybe that makes it easier. Maybe there's no baggage, no complicated history of difficult decisions. Maybe you're just a good surprise in his life." I wanted to believe that. I wanted to imagine William Blackstone's face lighting up when he realized he had a daughter, when he understood that the empire he'd built had an heir he'd never known existed. But I'd learned not to trust fairy tale endings. "There's something else," I said. "Something I haven't told you. He and his wife never had children. In all my research, there's no indication they ever had kids. What if that's by choice? What if they deliberately decided not to have a family? Or what if they tried and couldn't? What if discovering he has a daughter fills a hole in his life he didn't even know was there?" That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed running through scenarios, imagining conversations, trying to script the perfect way to reveal a truth that had no perfect delivery method. How do you tell someone that a brief relationship from decades ago created a life he never knew existed? How do you prove that you're not motivated by money when the revelation of your existence immediately raises questions about inheritance and wealth? By morning, I'd made a decision. Not the decision to tell him, not yet, but the decision to test the waters first, to create an opportunity for more personal contact before revealing the full truth. I'd use the opening he'd given me, his suggestion that I consider doing advocacy work on a larger scale. I spent Saturday morning crafting an email, drafting and redrafting until I had something that sounded professional but personal, grateful, but not obsequious. I thanked him for his visit to the Veterans Center, mentioned that his intervention had already helped Mrs. Rodriguez. Senator Williams's office had contacted the VA, and her benefits were being expedited. Then I asked if we could schedule a meeting to discuss his suggestion about policy advocacy. The response came Sunday evening, faster than I'd expected. William Blackstone's email was brief but warm, suggesting we meet for lunch on Wednesday at a restaurant downtown. He'd like to hear more about my ideas for systemic advocacy, and he had some thoughts about how his foundation might support that kind of work. I read the email 12 times, looking for subtext, for any indication that he suspected there was, more to my interest than professional development. But there was nothing beyond polite business correspondence and what seemed like genuine interest in my perspective. Wednesday arrived with unseasonable warmth, one of those October days that felt like summer's last gift before winter settled in for good. I chose my outfit carefully, professional but approachable, the kind of thing that would work equally well for a business lunch or the most important personal conversation of my life, depending on how the meeting unfolded. The restaurant William Blackstone had chosen was upscale, but not intimidating, the kind of place where business people met for serious conversations over excellent food. I arrived 10 minutes early and was shown to a quiet table near the window, where I could watch the street while I waited and tried to calm my racing heart. He arrived exactly on time, looking relaxed in a way he hadn't during the foundation visit. Without the formal structure of a site tour, without Catherine Mills and staff members creating professional distance, he seemed more accessible, more like a person than a position. "Jessica, thank you for reaching out," he said as we shook hands. "I've been thinking about our conversation all weekend. There's something about your approach to advocacy that reminds me of the kind of work I wish I saw more of in this world." We ordered lunch and settled into conversation about veterans issues, systemic problems in bureaucratic systems, the potential for foundation support of policy advocacy. But I found myself studying him as much as listening, noting the way he gestured when he talked about something he cared about, the way his voice softened when he mentioned his father's struggles with post-war adjustment. "I keep thinking about something you said during the tour," he said as our food arrived, "about growing up having to pay attention to subtext, about learning that what people don't say is often more important than what they do say. That's a sophisticated insight for someone your age. Sometimes childhood teaches you things you'd rather not have learned." He looked at me more carefully, and I saw something shift in his expression. Difficult family situation? It was the opening I'd been waiting for, the chance to begin revealing the truth without overwhelming him with the full revelation. My stepfather made it clear from early on that I was an unwelcome addition to his life. He married my mother when I was 3, but he never let me forget that I was someone else's responsibility that he'd been stuck with. That must have been painful. It was, especially not knowing anything about my biological father. My mother always said he was someone who'd left when things got complicated, but I've recently learned the truth is more complex than that. William Blackstone set down his fork, giving me his full attention. "Recently learned?" My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "I took a DNA test a few weeks ago to help a friend find his biological family, but I got some unexpected results of my own." What kind of results? This was it. The moment when I either found the courage to tell him the truth or backed down, and lived with the secret forever. I looked at his face, at the green eyes that were identical to mine, at the familiar bone structure that had shaped my own features, and I made my choice. The kind that told me my biological father isn't some deadbeat who abandoned my mother. The kind that told me he's a successful businessman who probably never knew I existed. The silence stretched between us, filled with the soft sounds of restaurant, conversation, and the weight of a truth that was about to change everything. William Blackstone stared at me, and I watched as understanding began to dawn in his expression. "Jessica, he said quietly. What exactly are you telling me? I'm telling you that 26 years ago, you had a relationship with a waitress named Linda Rodriguez in Norfolk, Virginia. And I'm telling you that I'm the daughter you never knew she was carrying when you left. The words hung in the air between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we were ready to cross. William Blackstone sat perfectly still, his face cycling through expressions I couldn't read. Shock, disbelief, something that might have been hope, and then a careful blankness that probably served him well in high-stakes business negotiations. Linda Rodriguez, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The waitress at Harbor View Restaurant. Thursday nights. You remember her. I remember her. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his silver hair. God, I remember her. She was brilliant. Not educated in the traditional sense, but sharp, insightful. She had these dreams about going to college, about making something of herself. She never got to college. She had me instead. He closed his eyes briefly. She tried to contact me. Multiple times. My assistant at the time said there were calls. From Norfolk. Messages that seemed personal rather than business-related. I told her to screen them out. I was engaged to Margaret, dealing with the acquisition, trying to keep my professional and personal lives separate. So you never knew. I never knew. He opened his eyes and looked directly at me. Jesus, Jessica, 26 years. You've been living 20 minutes away from my Richmond office, and I never knew I had a daughter. The word daughter hit me like electricity. He'd said it without hesitation, without demanding proof or DNA verification. He'd looked at my face and seen what I'd been seeing in mirrors my entire life, the undeniable resemblance that made explanation unnecessary. I have the DNA results, I said, reaching for my purse. If you want to see them, if you need proof. I don't need proof. His voice was steady now, carrying the certainty that came from years of making difficult decisions quickly. I can see it in your face, in your expressions, the way you tilt your head when you're thinking, the way your left eyebrow lifts higher than your right. You're my daughter. Tears I'd been holding back for weeks finally spilled over. I wasn't. Sure you'd want me to be. Want you to be? He reached across the table and took my hand, his grip warm and steady. Jessica, finding out I have a daughter isn't a complication. It's a miracle. Margaret and we tried for years to have children. Specialists, treatments, procedures, nothing worked. We eventually accepted that we'd never have a family, that the Blackstone name would end with me. And now? Now I find out that I've had a daughter all along. A daughter who served her country, who dedicates her life to helping other veterans, who has the courage to seek out a father who was essentially a stranger. How could I not want that? The relief was overwhelming. For 26 years, I'd carried the weight of being unwanted, of being a mistake that complicated everyone's life. To hear William Blackstone, my father, say that my existence was a miracle rather than a burden felt like setting down luggage I'd been carrying my entire adult life. There's something else you should know, I said. About your father's service, about why you're so committed to veterans' causes. It's not just about his Vietnam experience. He looked puzzled. What do you mean? You inherited more than his business acumen. You inherited his sense of duty, his commitment to service. I see it in how you run your foundation, how you personally intervene to help people like Mrs. Rodriguez. You may not have served in the military, but you've spent your entire career serving others. I never thought of it that way. Maybe that's why we connected so quickly yesterday. Recognition, even unconscious recognition. We're both trying to fill the same kind of hole, the need to matter, to serve something bigger than ourselves. He was quiet for a long moment, processing everything that had been revealed. What happens now, Jessica? How do we build a relationship from here? Carefully, I said. I don't want to disrupt your life, your marriage. I just want to know you, to understand where I came from, to maybe have the kind of father I always wondered about. You're not disrupting anything. You're completing something." He pulled out his phone. "I want to call Margaret. I want to tell her about you, introduce you to her if you're willing. Are you sure? This is a lot to process. Maybe you should talk to her privately first. Give her time to—" "Margaret has wanted children our entire marriage. She's going to see you as the answer to prayers she stopped praying years ago." He was already dialing. "Margaret, I need you to sit down. I have news that's going to change our lives." I listened as he explained the situation to his wife, his voice growing stronger and more excited with each sentence. He described meeting me at the Veterans Center, the DNA connection, the revelation that had just unfolded. From what I could hear of her responses, Margaret's reaction was everything he'd predicted. Shock, then joy, then immediate questions about when she could meet me. "She wants to know if you're free for dinner tonight," he said after hanging up. "She's already planning to cook to make sure we have your favorite foods. What do you like to eat?" "I'm not picky. I spent 4 years eating military rations." "Right. You served in Afghanistan." He shook his head, as if still processing the magnitude of everything he was learning. "My daughter is a veteran. My daughter served her country while I was safe, in boardrooms making money." "Your daughter learned values of service from a father she'd never met," I corrected. "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, even when the tree doesn't know there's an apple." That evening, I found myself sitting in William and Margaret Blackstone's dining room, sharing a meal with the parents I'd never known I had. Margaret was everything my mother had described from those Society magazine photos. Elegant, refined, someone who moved through wealth with natural grace. But she was also warm, curious, immediately interested in every detail of my life. "Tell me about your childhood," she said over dessert. "Tell me about the woman who raised our daughter. Our daughter." She'd claimed me as easily as William had, without hesitation or reservation. I told them about Linda, about Robert Kellerman, about growing up feeling displaced and unwanted, but I also told them about my mother's strength, her work ethic, the way she'd done her best in impossible circumstances. "I'd like to meet her," William said. "I'd like to thank her for raising you, for the sacrifices she made. She's been afraid of this conversation for 26 years. She thought you'd be angry, that finding out about me would complicate your life. The only thing I'm angry about is the time we've lost. But we can't change the past. We can only make the most of the future." 3 months later, I sat in the offices of Blackstone Industries, not as a foundation applicant, but as the newly appointed Director of Veterans Affairs for the entire organization. My job was to oversee the company's military-related charitable giving, to ensure that programs like the Richmond Veterans Assistance Center received the support they needed to expand their impact. Mrs. Rodriguez had received her survivor benefits, along with back payments that ensured her financial security. The Veterans Center had received a grant that tripled our capacity to serve local veterans. And I had found something I'd been looking for my entire life, a place where I belonged, work that mattered, and parents who saw me as a gift rather than a burden. The transition hadn't been seamless. Learning to navigate wealth and privilege required skills they didn't teach in the military. Building relationships with parents I'd never known meant starting from scratch with people who shared my DNA, but not my history. Integrating into William and Margaret's social world meant learning customs and expectations that felt foreign after a lifetime of working-class pragmatism. But every challenge was offset by the fundamental truth that had emerged from that first lunch conversation. I was wanted. After 26 years of feeling like an unwelcome accident, I'd discovered that my existence was actually a miracle that completed my father's life in ways he'd never expected. Robert Kellerman had been wrong about everything. I wasn't a mistake. I wasn't damaged goods. I wasn't someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps of affection came my way. I was William Ashford Blackstone III's daughter. I was an heir to a billion-dollar empire. I was someone whose voice mattered, whose ideas had value, whose presence made other people's lives better rather than worse. And sometimes, when I caught my reflection in the windows of my new office, I could see both parents in my features: Linda's determination and resilience, William's strategic mind and commitment to service. I was the product of a brief love affair that had created something lasting and meaningful, even when neither parent knew what they'd built together. My story isn't finished yet. There are still family dynamics to navigate, business skills to learn, relationships to build. But the fundamental question that had driven my entire life, whether I mattered, whether I belonged, whether I was worth loving, that question finally had an answer. Sometimes the truth finds you when you're not even looking for it. Sometimes a DNA test meant to help a friend ends up rewriting your entire understanding of who you are. Sometimes the father you thought abandoned you actually never knew you existed, and discovering you becomes the best surprise of his life. And sometimes, just sometimes, the little girl who grew up folding napkins into birds while being told she was a mistake grows up to soar higher than anyone, including herself, ever imagined possible. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like you didn't belong or wondered about your own hidden truths, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Share your own stories of unexpected discoveries, of finding family in surprising places, of learning that you mattered more than you ever knew. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories about ordinary people discovering extraordinary truths about their lives, make sure to subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell. Because everyone deserves to know they matter, and everyone's story deserves to be heard. Until next time, remember, you're not a mistake. You're not an accident. You're exactly who you're supposed to be, even if it takes time to discover what that means. Thank you for listening.